How could I have known what my own family was planning behind my back? The day my mute grandson spoke his first words to warn me, everything I believed about loyalty, respect, and trust was shattered. When the truth came out in front of everyone, my son and his wife learned what happens when you underestimate an old man with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The doorbell rang at precisely 8 in the morning, just like Monica had scheduled. I set down my coffee and walked to the front door of my suburban home, already knowing what awaited me on the other side. My son Ethan stood there with his usual impatient expression, checking his phone while his wife Monica held Caleb's small hand with the kind of grip that suggested duty rather than affection. "Morning, Dad," Ethan said without looking up from his screen. "We're running a bit behind schedule." Monica pushed past him, dragging Caleb into my living room like she owned the place. At 34, my daughter-in-law had perfected the art of making every interaction feel like a business transaction. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her designer clothes screamed money that I knew came from credit cards rather than savings. "Franklin," she said, using my full name in that condescending tone she'd adopted since marrying my son 7 years ago. "I've prepared a detailed schedule for Caleb's care while we're on the cruise." She thrust a laminated sheet into my hands, covered in color-coded time blocks and strict instructions. Breakfast at 8:30 sharp. Educational activities from 9 to 11. Lunch at noon exactly. No sugar after 3 p.m. Tablet time limited to 1 hour. And please, try to keep him quiet during his rest period. I looked down at my 8-year-old grandson, who stood silently beside his mother, his dark eyes watching everything with an intelligence that his parents consistently ignored. Caleb had been born mute, or so the doctors had told us when he failed to speak by age 3. But I'd noticed things lately, the way he moved his lips when he thought no one was looking, the soft sounds he made when he was alone with me. His parents, however, had long since stopped paying attention. "He's been using his communication tablet more frequently," Monica continued, pulling out an expensive device. "The speech therapist says he's making progress, but don't get your hopes up. You know how these things go with special needs children." The casual dismissal in her voice made my jaw clench. Ethan finally looked up from his phone, his 37-year-old face bearing the same impatient expression he'd worn since childhood, when forced to deal with anything that didn't directly benefit him. "Dad, we really need to get going. The car service will be here any minute." He glanced around my modest living room with barely concealed disdain. "Are you sure you can handle this? I mean, Caleb has specific needs, and you're not exactly—" "I raised you, didn't I?" I interrupted, my voice steady despite the irritation building in my chest. Monica laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the morning air. "That was 30 years ago, Franklin. Things are different now. Children like Caleb require specialized care and understanding. We can't just wing it anymore." She knelt down beside Caleb, her voice taking on the artificially sweet tone she used whenever other people might be watching. "Now, sweetheart, you be good for Grandpa Franklin. Use your tablet if you need anything, and remember, no running around or making noise. Grandpa is old and needs his quiet time." Caleb nodded silently, but his eyes found mine over his mother's shoulder. There was something there, a depth of understanding that his parents had never bothered to recognize. "We'll be back Sunday evening," Ethan said, already heading toward the door. "Try not to spoil him too much, Dad. He needs structure, not indulgence." Monica stood and brushed invisible lint from her pants. "Oh, and Franklin, I made you some herbal tea. It's in the kitchen. Dr. Pemberton says men your age should be drinking more antioxidants for heart health. Make sure you drink it before bed tonight." She pointed to a thermal carafe sitting on my kitchen counter, steam still rising from the spout. "It's a special blend I ordered online. Very expensive, very beneficial. Don't let it go to waste." The way she emphasized the words made something uncomfortable twist in my stomach, but I pushed the feeling aside. Monica was always pushing her health fads and expensive remedies on everyone around her. "Thanks," I said simply, not trusting myself to say more. Ethan was already outside, loading their designer luggage into a black sedan that had pulled up to the curb. Monica gave Caleb a perfunctory kiss on the forehead and headed for the door. "Remember, Franklin, follow the schedule. Caleb does best with routine and minimal stimulation. We can't afford any setbacks in his development." And then they were gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of Monica's expensive perfume and the weight of their casual dismissal. I closed the door and turned to find Caleb standing in the middle of my living room, watching me with those intelligent dark eyes. "Well, buddy," I said, crouching down to his level. "Looks like it's just you and me for the next few days." He nodded and reached for his communication tablet, but something in his expression made me pause. There was an urgency there, a need to communicate something beyond the simple requests his parents had trained him to make. I spent the morning following Monica's rigid schedule, more out of habit than conviction. We ate breakfast at exactly 8:30, whole grain toast with sugar-free jam that tasted like cardboard. The educational activities consisted of workbooks filled with exercises clearly designed for children half Caleb's age. But throughout it all, I noticed Caleb watching me, his lips moving silently, his hands twitching as if he wanted to reach out and grab my attention. At lunch, I decided to deviate from the script. Instead of the prescribed meal of steamed vegetables and lean protein, I made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, comfort food that reminded me of the meals I'd shared with Ethan when he was Caleb's age, before life had hardened him into the dismissive stranger who'd left that morning. Caleb's eyes lit up when I placed the golden sandwich in front of him. He took a bite and actually smiled, the first genuine expression of joy I'd seen from him all day. "Good?" I asked. He nodded enthusiastically and took another bite. For a moment, I could swear I heard a soft sound escape his lips. Not quite a word, but something close to one. After lunch, we walked to the neighborhood park, abandoning Monica's schedule entirely. The fresh air and open space seemed to energize Caleb in a way that the structured indoor activities never had. He ran ahead of me to the swings, his tablet forgotten in my jacket pocket. As I pushed him higher and higher, I heard it again, soft sounds that could have been laughter. My heart swelled with a mixture of joy and anger. Joy at seeing my grandson truly happy, and anger at the realization that his parents were so focused on managing his disability that they'd never bothered to nurture his possibilities. "Having fun?" I asked. Caleb turned to look at me over his shoulder, and for a split second, I could swear his lips formed the word yes. But before I could be certain, another voice interrupted the moment. "Excuse me, are you the caregiver?" I turned to find a well-dressed woman in her 40s standing nearby, watching us with the kind of polite curiosity that wealthy suburbanites use to gather gossip. "I'm his grandfather," I replied. Her expression shifted slightly, taking in my worn jeans and flannel shirt, clearly trying to reconcile my appearance with the expensive clothes Caleb wore. "Oh, I just assumed, I see him here sometimes with his parents, and they mentioned they had help with his special needs. You must be very dedicated to take on such a challenging responsibility at your age." The casual assumption that I couldn't possibly be family, that I must be hired help, echoed the same dismissive attitude I'd been enduring from my own son and daughter-in-law. I felt Caleb swing slow as he listened to the conversation, his small hands gripping the chains tighter. "He's not a responsibility," I said quietly. "He's my grandson." The woman's face flushed slightly, but she pressed on with the kind of entitled persistence that came from a life without real consequences. "Of course, I didn't mean to offend. It's just that children with developmental delays can be so demanding. My sister has one, and it's absolutely exhausting. The constant supervision, the special diets, the therapy appointments. I don't know how families cope, especially when the grandparents get involved. Sometimes the older generation just doesn't understand the complexities of modern special needs care." I helped Caleb down from the swing, my hands shaking slightly with suppressed anger. He immediately moved to stand beside me, his small hand slipping into mine in a gesture of solidarity that made my chest tight. "We should head home," I said, not trusting myself to respond to the woman's ignorant assumptions. As we walked back to the house, I felt Caleb squeeze my hand 3 times, a pattern I recognized from his early childhood, before his parents had decided that such meaningless gestures weren't worth encouraging. It was his way of saying, "I love you," a code we'd developed when he was too young for formal communication devices. I squeezed back 3 times and felt him lean against my side as we walked. That evening, I ignored Monica's prescribed dinner menu and ordered pizza instead. Caleb's delight was worth whatever lecture I'd receive when his parents returned. We ate on the living room floor, watching cartoons that Monica would have deemed overstimulating, and for the first time in months, my house felt like a home instead of a way station. As bedtime approached, I remembered Monica's insistence about the herbal tea. The thermal carafe still sat on the kitchen counter, its contents probably still warm. I poured myself a cup, noting the strange, bitter smell that seemed at odds with the supposedly beneficial herbs Monica had described. "Time for bed, buddy," I called to Caleb, who was arranging his communication tablet on the coffee table. He looked up at me, then at the steaming mug in my hand. Something shifted in his expression, a sudden alertness that made me pause. "What is it?" I asked. He stood slowly, his eyes fixed on the teacup. His mouth opened and closed several times, as if he were trying to force words that wouldn't come. The frustration on his face was heartbreaking. "It's okay," I said gently. "Take your time." But instead of reaching for his tablet, Caleb walked directly to me. He stood close enough that I could see the determination in his dark eyes, the same stubborn set to his jaw that had characterized his father at that age. I heard Ethan and Monica's car doors slam in the driveway, their voices carrying through the evening air as they prepared to leave for their cruise. The sound of their departure seemed to unlock something in Caleb. As the front door clicked shut behind them, my grandson looked straight into my eyes and spoke in a clear, perfect voice that sent a sudden chill through me. "Grandpa, don't drink the tea Mom made. She planned something." The mug slipped from my nerveless fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor as I stared down at the boy who had just spoken his first words. Words that suggested my own family was plotting against me. The broken ceramic scattered across my kitchen floor like pieces of a puzzle I was afraid to solve. I knelt down slowly, my 62-year-old knees protesting as I gathered the larger shards, my mind reeling from what I'd just heard. Caleb stood perfectly still, watching me with those intelligent eyes that I now realized had been seeing far more than any of us had given him credit for. When I looked up at him, he didn't retreat or pretend the moment hadn't happened. Instead, he spoke again, his voice soft but clear. "I've been able to talk for a while now, Grandpa, but they don't listen when I try." My hands trembled as I disposed of the broken mug. 8 years of believing my grandson was trapped in silence, and here he was, speaking as clearly as any child his age. The implications crashed over me like a wave. "How long?" I managed to ask. "Since I was 6. It started slow, just a few words. But when I tried to show Mom and Dad, they said I was just making noise. Mom said it was better if I used the tablet so I wouldn't embarrass myself." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. I thought back to all the times I'd seen Caleb's lips moving, all the soft sounds I'd dismissed as meaningless vocalizations. How many times had he tried to speak, only to be silenced by parents who found his disability more convenient than his progress? "What did you mean about the tea?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. Caleb glanced toward the kitchen counter where the thermal carafe still sat, then back at me. "I heard Mom talking to Grandma Linda on the phone yesterday. She said the tea would make you sleepy so you'd have an accident. Then they could say you weren't safe to live alone anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sank into one of my kitchen chairs, trying to process what my 8-year-old grandson had just revealed. My own son and daughter-in-law had been planning to secretly medicate me, hoping I'd stumble or something even more serious would happen, so they could justify taking control of my life and property. "Are you sure that's what you heard?" I asked, though I could see the certainty in his young face. "She said the cruise was perfect timing because they'd be away when it happened. She said Grandma Linda could find you and call for help, and then everyone would agree you needed to go to one of those places where old people live. Assisted living. They wanted to warehouse me in some facility where I'd be out of their way, probably so they could get their hands on the house and the modest inheritance my late wife Margaret had left. The house that had been in our family for 30 years, where I'd raised Ethan, where Margaret had tended her garden until cancer took her 5 years ago. I looked at Caleb, this brave little boy who had risked revealing his secret to protect me, and felt something harden in my chest. If Monica and Ethan thought they could manipulate an old man and neglect a special needs child without consequences, they were about to learn otherwise. "Caleb," I said carefully, "have you tried to talk to other people? Your teachers, maybe?" He nodded. "Mrs. Patterson at school knows I can talk. She's been working with me during lunch periods when the other kids aren't around, but Mom and Dad never come to the meetings anymore. So Mrs. Patterson can't tell them about my progress." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. I remembered the school calls that Ethan and Monica always seemed too busy to take, the parent-teacher conferences they'd stopped attending once Caleb's initial diagnosis had been established. They'd written him off as a burden to be managed rather than a child to be nurtured. That night, after I'd tucked Caleb into bed in the guest room, I sat in my garage workshop surrounded by the tools and projects that had kept me occupied since Margaret was gone. The familiar smell of sawdust and motor oil usually calmed me, but tonight my mind was racing with possibilities and plans. I pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. If Monica and Ethan thought they could outmaneuver me, they'd forgotten that I'd spent 40 years as a contractor, managing complex projects and dealing with people who tried to cheat the system. I knew how to gather evidence, how to document problems, and how to build a case that would stand up to scrutiny. The first thing I needed was proof of Caleb's abilities. Mrs. Patterson would be a crucial witness, but I needed more than just her word. I needed documentation, recordings, evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. I also needed to understand the full scope of Monica and Ethan's plans. The tea incident was just one piece of a larger puzzle. How long had they been planning this? What other steps had they taken to position themselves as my caretakers and Caleb's guardians? As I sat in the quiet garage, surrounded by the projects Margaret and I had planned together, I thought about the trust she'd established before she passed away. Margaret had been a teacher for 30 years, and she'd seen enough family drama to know that money and property could bring out the worst in people. She'd been very specific about her wishes. Everything was to go to Caleb when he came of age, with me as the trustee until then. But if something happened to me, if I were declared incompetent or unable to care for myself, control would pass to Caleb's parents. Monica and Ethan would have access to Margaret's life insurance, the house, and the modest investment portfolio we'd built together, more than enough to fund their lifestyle and pay for the cruise they were currently enjoying. The next morning, I called Caleb's school and arranged to meet with Mrs. Patterson during her lunch break. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor that came from years of working with children who needed extra attention. "Mr. Harlow," she said as we sat in her empty classroom, "I'm so glad you called. I've been trying to reach Caleb's parents for months about his progress." "What kind of progress?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. She pulled out a thick folder filled with worksheets, drawings, and notes. "Caleb has been speaking in full sentences since the beginning of the school year. His vocabulary is actually above grade level, and his reading comprehension is exceptional. I've been documenting everything, hoping to share the good news with his parents, but they never return my calls." She showed me pages of Caleb's work, stories he'd written, math problems he'd solved, drawings that showed a sophisticated understanding of the world around him. It was the portfolio of a bright, capable child, not the limited special needs student his parents had resigned themselves to managing. "Why do you think he doesn't speak at home?" Mrs. Patterson asked. I thought about Monica's dismissive attitude, Ethan's impatience, and the rigid schedule that left no room for exploration or growth. "I think he learned it wasn't worth the effort," I said quietly. That afternoon, I took Caleb to the neighborhood park again, but this time I brought along a small digital recorder that I'd used for work projects. As we walked, I encouraged him to talk about school, his friends, his interests. His voice grew stronger and more confident with each passing minute, as if he were remembering what it felt like to be heard. "Do you like living with Mom and Dad?" I asked gently. His expression grew serious. "They're always busy, and they get frustrated when I try to show them things. It's easier to just use the tablet and stay quiet." "What about when you're with me?" For the first time since I'd known him, Caleb smiled a real, uninhibited smile. "You listen to me, Grandpa. You see me." That evening, I called my old friend Pauline Turner, who lived 3 houses down and had been a pediatric nurse before retiring. Pauline had always been fond of Caleb, and I trusted her judgment about children and family dynamics. "Franklin," she said when I explained the situation, "I've been worried about that boy for months. I see him in the backyard sometimes when his parents think no one's watching. Monica talks to him like he's a pet rather than a child, and Ethan barely acknowledges he exists. Would you be willing to spend some time with him tomorrow?" I asked. "I want an independent assessment of his abilities." "Of course. And Franklin? If what you're telling me is true, if they really tried to tamper with your health, then we need to think about getting some legal advice. This isn't just about family disagreements anymore." That night, as I helped Caleb get ready for bed, he looked up at me with those serious dark eyes and asked, "Grandpa, are you going to send me back to them?" The question broke my heart. "What do you want, buddy?" "I want to stay with you. You make me feel like I matter." I knelt down and pulled him into a hug, feeling his small arms wrap around my neck. "You do matter, Caleb, more than you know, and I'm going to make sure you're safe and happy, no matter what it takes." As I turned off his bedroom light, I made a silent promise to Margaret's memory and to the brave little boy who had trusted me with his secret. Monica and Ethan had underestimated both of us, and they were about to learn that some mistakes come with permanent consequences. In my workshop that night, I opened the locked filing cabinet where I kept important documents and pulled out Margaret's will and the trust papers. It was time to call Vivian Carter, the attorney who had helped us establish our estate plan. If Monica and Ethan wanted a fight, I'd give them one, but it would be fought on my terms, with weapons they didn't even know I possessed. The next morning brought an unexpected test of my resolve. I was making breakfast, real pancakes, not the sugar-free cardboard Monica had prescribed, when my phone rang. Ethan's name appeared on the caller ID, and I felt my stomach tighten. "Hey, Dad," his voice crackled through the ship's satellite connection. "Just checking in. How's Caleb doing?" I glanced at my grandson, who was setting the table with the careful precision of a child who had learned that doing things correctly was the best way to avoid criticism. He looked up at me, and I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "He's fine," I said carefully. "We're managing." Good. Monica wanted me to remind you about his schedule. She's very particular about routine, you know. Kids like Caleb need structure. Kids like Caleb. as if my grandson were a category rather than an individual. "Did you drink the tea she left?" Monica's voice came from the background, sharp and insistent. "I'll get to it," I replied, not technically lying. "Make sure you do," she called out. "It's expensive stuff, and it's specifically formulated for men your age. Dr. Pemberton says antioxidants are crucial for preventing cognitive decline." Cognitive decline. The phrase hung in the air like a threat. After I hung up, Caleb came to stand beside me. "Are you okay, Grandpa?" "I'm fine, buddy, but I think we need to have a serious talk." We sat at the kitchen table, our pancakes growing cold as I explained what I was beginning to understand about his parents' plans. Caleb listened with the kind of focused attention that most adults would have envied, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights that revealed just how much he'd been observing and processing. "I heard Dad talking to someone about money problems," Caleb said quietly. "Something about credit cards and the mortgage on their house. He sounded scared." Another piece of the puzzle. Financial pressure would explain the urgency of their scheme. They needed access to my assets, and they needed it soon. "Caleb," I said gently, "I need to ask you to do something brave. I need you to help me document what's been happening. Can you do that?" He nodded solemnly. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to show other people that you can talk and think and understand things. It might be scary because your parents have taught you to hide these abilities, but it's important. Will you be with me?" "Every step of the way." That afternoon, Pauline came over for what I'd told her was a casual visit. She brought homemade cookies and a warm smile, settling into my living room like the surrogate grandmother Caleb had never really had. "So, Caleb," she said, "your grandfather tells me you're quite the artist. Would you like to show me some of your drawings?" What followed was a revelation. Caleb not only showed Pauline his artwork, but explained each piece in detail, describing his techniques, his inspiration, and the stories behind each image. His vocabulary was sophisticated, his reasoning clear, and his creativity evident in every line and color choice. Pauline, to her credit, didn't show surprise at hearing him speak. Instead, she engaged with him as she would any bright 8-year-old, asking follow-up questions and showing genuine interest in his responses. "Caleb," she said after an hour of conversation, "you're one of the most articulate children I've ever met. Your parents must be so proud of your progress." Caleb's expression grew guarded. "They don't really like it when I talk. Mom says it's better if I use the tablet so I don't confuse people." Pauline's professional composure cracked slightly. "Confuse people about what?" "About whether I'm really disabled or just pretending." The casual way he repeated what were clearly his mother's words made my hands clench into fists. Pauline caught my eye over Caleb's head, and I saw my own anger reflected in her expression. After Pauline left, promising to return the next day with her camera to document more of Caleb's abilities, I received an unexpected visitor. Our Sandra Miles, the housekeeper who came twice a week to help me maintain the house Margaret and I had once filled with life, stood on my doorstep with a troubled expression. "Mr. Harlow," she said, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by, but I heard voices earlier and wanted to make sure everything was all right." Sandra was a woman in her late 50s who had worked for several families in the neighborhood. She was discreet, professional, and had never shown any interest in family drama. The fact that she was here now, clearly agitated, told me something significant was happening. "What's wrong, Sandra?" "It's Mrs. Harlow. Monica, I mean. She called me this morning, asking about your routine, wanted to know what time you usually went to bed, whether you ever seemed confused or forgetful. She said she was worried about your health." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Monica wasn't just planning to interfere with my well-being. She was laying the groundwork for a narrative about my declining mental state. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you seemed fine to me, sharp as ever. But Mr. Harlow, the way she was asking those questions, it felt like she was fishing for something specific, like she wanted me to say you were having problems. Did she ask you to do anything else?" Sandra hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "She wanted me to start keeping notes about your behavior, said the family was concerned and that it would be helpful to have documentation if you ever needed additional care." Additional care. The euphemism made my skin crawl. "Sandra," I said carefully, "I need to ask you something important. In all the time you've been working for me, have you ever seen any signs that I'm not capable of living independently?" "Absolutely not," she replied without hesitation. "You're more organized than half the people I work for, and you've never shown any confusion or memory problems. If anything, you seem lonely since Mrs. Margaret passed, but that's not the same thing as being incompetent." That evening, after Caleb had gone to bed, I sat in my workshop making phone calls. The first was to Vivian Carter, Margaret's attorney and an old family friend. "Franklin," Her familiar voice was warm but professional. I was sorry to hear about the troubles with Ethan and Monica. What can I do to help? I explained the situation in detail, from the tampered tea to Caleb's unexpected abilities to the financial pressure that seemed to be driving my son's desperation. Vivian listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. This is serious, Franklin. If what you're telling me is accurate, we're looking at potential elder abuse, child neglect, and fraud. But we need to be very careful about how we proceed. What do you recommend? First, we need to document everything. I want you to write down every conversation, every incident, every piece of evidence you can remember. Second, we need to get Caleb's abilities officially assessed by qualified professionals. Third, we need to review your estate planning to make sure your assets are protected. What about custody of Caleb? That's the most complex piece. Ethan and Monica are his legal parents, and family courts are reluctant to remove children from their biological parents unless there's clear evidence of abuse or neglect. But if we can demonstrate that they're deliberately hindering his development and that he thrives in your care, we might have a case. The next call was to Derek Martin, a social worker I'd met through Margaret's volunteer work at the Children's Hospital. That's how Derek specialized in cases involving children with special needs, and I trusted his judgment about family dynamics. Franklin, he said when I explained the situation, this sounds like a case of what we call diagnostic overshadowing. The parents become so focused on managing a disability that they stop seeing the child's potential for growth and development. Is that grounds for intervention? It can be, especially if the child's needs aren't being met. Would you be willing to let me do an informal assessment of Caleb? I could visit as a family friend just to get a sense of his current functioning level. I'd appreciate that. As I hung up the phone, I felt the weight of what I was setting in motion. By tomorrow evening, Monica and Ethan would return from their cruise expecting to find me incapacitated or worse, with Caleb as a traumatized witness to my accident. Instead, they'd find a grandfather who had discovered their plan and a grandson who was ready to speak his truth. I walked through my house, looking at the family photos that lined the hallways. Pictures of Ethan as a baby, his first steps, his graduation from college, images of Margaret in her garden, her hands dirty but her smile radiant. Photos of Caleb as a toddler, before his silence had been labeled as a permanent limitation. In the guest room, I checked on my grandson, who was sleeping peacefully for the first time since I'd known him. Tomorrow, his world would change forever. But for the first time in years, I believed it would change for the better. I returned to my workshop and pulled out a fresh legal pad. Vivian was right. Documentation would be crucial. I began writing, starting with the day Caleb was born and working forward through 8 years of gradually escalating neglect and dismissal. By the time I finished, dawn was breaking, and I had a 20-page chronicle of how my son had transformed from a loving child into a man willing to tamper with his own father's health and silence his own son for money. The war was about to begin, but I was no longer fighting alone. I had allies, evidence, and something Monica and Ethan had never bothered to acquire: the truth. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that Margaret had always loved. I found myself thinking of her as I prepared breakfast for Caleb, wondering what she would make of the situation we found ourselves in. She'd always been the diplomatic one in our marriage, the peacemaker who could find common ground in any conflict, but she'd also been fiercely protective of family, and I knew she would have been appalled by what Ethan and Monica were attempting. Derek Martin arrived at 10 o'clock carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of casual clothes that wouldn't intimidate a child. He was a tall, lean man in his early 40s with graying temples and the patient demeanor that came from years of working with families in crisis. "Caleb," I said as I introduced them, "this is Mr. Derek. He's a friend of mine who works with children. Would you like to show him some of your artwork?" What followed was the most comprehensive demonstration of Caleb's abilities that I'd ever witnessed. Derek had brought a series of age-appropriate assessments disguised as games and activities, and Caleb approached each one with enthusiasm and confidence. He read passages from books meant for children 2 grades ahead of his current level. He solved math problems that required abstract reasoning and logical thinking. He engaged in conversations about complex topics, demonstrating not just intelligence but emotional maturity that belied his 8 years. "Caleb," Derek said during a break, "can you tell me about your school? What's your favorite subject?" "I like writing stories," Caleb replied without hesitation. "Mrs. Patterson lets me write about anything I want during lunch period. I wrote one about a boy who could fly but had to pretend he couldn't because his family thought flying was too dangerous." Derek glanced at me, then back at Caleb. "That sounds like an interesting story. Do you ever feel like you have to pretend about things?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his expression growing serious. Sometimes it's easier to let people think you can't do things than to keep trying to show them you can. "Can you give me an example?" My mom bought me a communication tablet because she said it was better than trying to talk, but I don't really need it anymore. I just use it because it makes her happy. Derek spent another hour with us, documenting Caleb's responses and taking notes. When he was finished, he asked to speak with me privately. "Franklin," he said as we stood in my garage workshop, "that child is functioning at or above grade level in every area I tested. His communication skills are exceptional, his reasoning abilities are advanced, and his emotional intelligence is remarkable. But his parents think he's severely disabled. That's the concerning part. Either they haven't been paying attention to his development, or they've been actively discouraging it. Both scenarios raise serious questions about the quality of care he's receiving." Derek pulled out his phone and showed me a video he'd recorded with Caleb's permission, my grandson explaining the plot of a book he'd read, using vocabulary and concepts that would have impressed a middle school teacher. "I'm going to write up a formal assessment," Derek continued. "This kind of documentation could be crucial if there are ever questions about Caleb's best interests." That afternoon, Vivian Carter arrived for our scheduled meeting. She was a woman in her mid-50s with silver hair and the sharp eyes of someone who had spent 30 years navigating family law. She'd helped Margaret and me establish our wills and trusts, and I knew she had our family's best interests at heart. "Franklin," she said as we settled in my living room, "I've reviewed the documents you sent me, and I have to say, this is one of the most troubling cases I've encountered." She spread a series of papers across my coffee table: bank statements, property deeds, insurance policies, and the trust documents Margaret had established before she passed away. "Let's start with the financial picture," she said. "Your assets include this house, which is worth approximately $400,000, Margaret's life insurance policy worth $200,000, and investment accounts totaling another $300,000. All told, nearly $1 million that would pass to Caleb under the terms of Margaret's trust. With me as the trustee until he turns 18. Exactly. But if something were to happen to you, or if you were declared incompetent, control would pass to his legal guardians, currently Ethan and Monica." The implications were staggering. No wonder they were willing to risk interfering with my health. $1 million would solve their financial problems and fund their lifestyle for years to come. "What options do we have?" I asked. "Several, but we need to move carefully. First, I can help you establish a new trust structure that would prevent Ethan and Monica from accessing the funds even if something happened to you. Second, we can document Caleb's actual abilities and needs, which would support an argument for modified custody arrangements. Third, we can gather evidence of their neglect and present it to the appropriate authorities." Vivian pulled out a thick folder. "I've already started the paperwork for the trust modifications. We can establish an independent trustee, someone with no financial interest in the outcome, who would manage Caleb's inheritance until he reaches adulthood." "What about custody?" "That's more complex. Family courts prefer to keep children with their biological parents unless there's clear evidence of abuse or neglect. But we might be able to argue for shared custody or supervised visitation, especially given Caleb's special needs and his obvious bond with you." We spent the next 2 hours going through legal strategies and documentation requirements. Vivian explained that we would need to build an airtight case, with multiple witnesses and professional assessments, before we could challenge Ethan and Monica's parental rights. "The good news," she said as she prepared to leave, "is that they've made several mistakes. The attempt to tamper with your health, if we can prove it, crosses a serious legal line. Their neglect of Caleb's developmental needs could be considered child endangerment, and their financial desperation gives us a clear motive for their actions." That evening, I received a call from Mrs. Patterson at Caleb's school. She had heard from Derek about the assessment and wanted to share her own documentation of Caleb's progress. "Mr. Harlow," she said, "I've been teaching for 25 years, and Caleb is one of the brightest students I've ever worked with. The fact that his parents haven't been responding to my reports about his development is deeply concerning." "What kind of reports?" "I've sent home weekly progress notes since the beginning of the school year, documenting his verbal communication, his academic achievements, and his social development. I've also requested multiple parent conferences to discuss modifying his educational plan. None of my communications have been acknowledged." She promised to compile all of her documentation and make it available for any legal proceedings that might follow. Another ally, another piece of evidence in the case I was building. As I tucked Caleb into bed that night, he looked up at me with those serious dark eyes and asked, "Grandpa, are you going to be in trouble for helping me?" "What do you mean, buddy?" "Mom and Dad are going to be angry when they find out I can talk. They don't like it when people don't follow their rules." I sat on the edge of his bed, choosing my words carefully. "Sometimes, Caleb, adults make mistakes. Sometimes they get so focused on what they think is best that they stop listening to what's actually happening. Your parents love you, but they've made some mistakes about what you need. Are you going to fix it?" "I'm going to try. But it might be scary for a while, and there might be some difficult conversations. Can you be brave?" He nodded solemnly. "I can be brave if you are with me." "I'll always be with you, buddy, no matter what happens." As I turned off his light, I felt the weight of the promise I'd just made. Tomorrow, Monica and Ethan would return from their cruise, expecting to find their plan in motion. Instead, they would discover that their quiet, manageable father and their silent, disabled son had become formidable opponents. In my workshop that night, I made one final set of phone calls. To Sandra, asking her to document any future contacts from Monica about my supposed cognitive decline. To Pauline, requesting that she be available as a character witness. To Derek, confirming that his assessment would be ready for legal review. The pieces were in place. The evidence was gathered. The allies were positioned. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin, but tonight, for the first time in months, I felt like I had a chance of winning. I looked at the framed photo of Margaret that sat on my workbench, her smile as warm and encouraging as it had been in life. "I hope I'm doing the right thing," I whispered to her image. "I hope I'm strong enough to see this through." In the silence of my garage, surrounded by the tools and projects that had sustained me through 5 years of widowhood, I felt her presence like a gentle hand on my shoulder. Margaret had always believed that family was worth fighting for, even when the fight was against family itself. Tomorrow, Monica and Ethan would learn that they had underestimated both the old man they planned to warehouse and the child they had chosen to silence. The war was about to begin in earnest, and I intended to win. Sunday evening arrived with the kind of deceptive tranquility that preceded thunderstorms. Caleb and I had spent the day in careful preparation, reviewing what would happen when his parents returned and making sure he understood his role in the events that would follow. "Remember," I said, as we organized his artwork and schoolwork into neat piles, "you don't have to be afraid to talk anymore. Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Derrick, and Ms. Carter all know you can speak, and they're going to help make sure your parents listen." Caleb nodded, his small hands carefully arranging the drawings that would serve as evidence of his capabilities. "What if they get really angry?" "They probably will be angry," I admitted. "But being angry doesn't make them right, and you won't be alone." At 6 o'clock, I heard the familiar sound of a car door slamming in the driveway. Through the living room window, I watched Ethan and Monica emerge from their rideshare vehicle, their designer luggage and tanned faces evidence of the cruise they'd enjoyed while plotting my downfall. Monica was already talking before she reached the front door, her voice carrying the artificial brightness she used when she wanted to appear concerned. "Franklin," she called as she entered without knocking. "We're back. How did everything go?" Ethan followed behind her, checking his phone with the distracted air of someone whose mind was already on tomorrow's work meetings. They both looked relaxed, confident, and completely unprepared for what awaited them. "Everything went fine," I replied calmly. Monica's eyes immediately went to the kitchen counter, where the thermal carafe still sat exactly where she'd left it. "Did you drink the tea I made? It's been sitting there for days." "I decided not to," I said simply. Her expression shifted slightly, a flicker of concern crossing her features. "Why not? I told you it was specifically formulated for men your age. Dr. Pemberton says—" "I know what Dr. Pemberton says," I interrupted, "but I'm feeling fine without it." Ethan looked up from his phone, sensing tension he couldn't quite identify. "Where's Caleb?" "In his room, packing his things." "Packing?" Monica's voice sharpened. "What do you mean, packing?" Before I could answer, Caleb appeared in the living room doorway, his small suitcase in one hand and his communication tablet in the other. But instead of the silent, obedient child his parents expected, he looked directly at them and spoke in a clear, confident voice. "Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. I hope you had a good cruise." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Monica's face went white, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Ethan actually dropped his phone, the device clattering against the hardwood floor. "What? How?" Monica stammered. "I can talk now," Caleb said matter-of-factly. I've been able to for a while, but you never seemed interested in listening." Ethan found his voice first. "This is impossible. The doctor said—" "The doctor said his speech might develop over time," I interjected. "You just stopped paying attention to his progress." Monica's shock was rapidly transforming into something else, anger mixed with what looked like panic. "This doesn't make sense. Caleb, use your tablet. You know you're not supposed to confuse people by making noises." "I'm not making noises, Mom. I'm talking, like this. Grandpa and I had a really good time while you were gone. We made pancakes and went to the park and read stories together. I told him about school and my friends and the book I'm writing." The casual revelation that her son had been living a full, communicative life in her absence seemed to break something in Monica. She turned on me with fury in her eyes. "What did you do to him? What kind of therapy did you put him through without our permission? I didn't do anything except listen to him, I replied calmly. Something you might want to try. This is unacceptable, Ethan said, his voice rising. You had no right to make changes to his treatment plan. We're his parents. And as his parents, you should be celebrating his progress instead of trying to silence him. Monica was pacing now, her designer heels clicking against the floor like a metronome counting down to an explosion. We need to call Dr. Pemberton immediately. This kind of sudden change could indicate a neurological event. Caleb might be having some kind of episode. I'm not having an episode, Mom, Caleb said quietly. I'm just not pretending anymore. The simple honesty of his statement hung in the air like an accusation. Monica stopped pacing and stared at her son as if seeing him for the first time. Pretending? She repeated. You seemed happier when I used the tablet and stayed quiet, so I did. But Grandpa likes it when I talk, so I talk to him. Ethan ran his hands through his hair, clearly struggling to process what he was hearing. Dad, we need to discuss this privately. Caleb, go to your room. Actually, I said, Caleb and I have some things we need to share with you, things that happened while you were away. I gestured toward the living room chairs, but Monica remained standing, her arms crossed defensively across her chest. What things? She demanded. Well, for starters, Caleb's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, has been trying to reach you for months about his progress. She has documentation showing that he's been speaking in class since the beginning of the school year. Monica's face flushed. That's impossible. We would have been notified. You were notified. Multiple times. You just didn't respond to the calls or emails. I pulled out the folder of documentation that Mrs. Patterson had provided, spreading the progress reports and communication logs across the coffee table. The evidence was damning. Weeks of unreturned calls, ignored emails, and missed conference requests. We've been busy, Ethan said weakly. Work has been demanding, and... Too busy to know that your son is thriving? I asked. Too busy to celebrate his breakthrough? Monica was studying the papers with growing alarm, clearly recognizing the implications of such thorough documentation of their neglect. This doesn't change anything, she said finally. Caleb still has special needs. He still requires structured care and professional oversight. You can't just decide to upend his treatment plan because you spent a few days together. You're right, I agreed, which is why I've arranged for him to be assessed by qualified professionals. I pulled out Derek's preliminary report, watching as Monica's eyes scanned the summary of Caleb's advanced capabilities and emotional maturity. This is biased, she said immediately. You obviously coached him, told him what to say to make us look bad. Nobody coached me, Mom, Caleb said softly. Mr. Derek just asked me questions and listened to my answers, like Grandpa does. The comparison clearly stung. Monica turned on me with renewed fury. I don't know what game you're playing, Franklin, but this ends now. Caleb is our son, and we're taking him home. Of course you are, I said calmly. But there are a few other things we need to discuss first. I reached for the thermal carafe, noting how Monica's eyes tracked the movement with barely concealed anxiety. For instance, this tea you insisted I drink, the one you said was so important for my health. What about it? Well, I had it tested. Interesting ingredients for an herbal health blend. It was a bluff. I hadn't actually had the tea analyzed. But Monica's reaction told me everything I needed to know. Her face went pale again, and she exchanged a quick glance with Ethan. I don't know what you're implying, she said carefully. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. You left me tea with instructions to drink it before bed. You called to make sure I was following your directions, and you arranged for Linda to check on me while you were conveniently out of town. Ethan was looking between his wife and me with growing confusion. What's he talking about, Monica? Nothing. He's being paranoid. The tea was for his health, just like I said. Then you won't mind if I have it properly analyzed by a laboratory? The silence that followed was deafening. Monica stood frozen, clearly calculating her options, while Ethan slowly began to understand that something far more serious than family disagreements was unfolding in my living room. Mom, Caleb said quietly, why did you want Grandpa to drink the tea? I heard you talking to Grandma Linda about making him sleepy. The innocent question from their 8-year-old son was the final blow. Monica's carefully constructed facade crumbled completely, replaced by the desperate anger of someone whose plans had been thoroughly exposed. You turned our own son against us, she hissed at me. You poisoned his mind with lies and manipulation. I didn't turn anyone against anyone, I replied. I just listened to what he had to say. Maybe you should try it sometime. Ethan was staring at his wife with dawning horror. Monica, what did you put in that tea? Nothing harmful, she said quickly. Just something to help him rest better. He's been having trouble since Margaret passed away, and I thought... You thought you could slip something into my drink without my knowledge or consent, I finished. So I'd have an incident that would justify putting me in assisted living. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Ethan looked as if someone had punched him in the stomach, while Monica's face cycled through denial, anger, and finally, desperate justification. You don't understand the pressure we're under, she said, her voice breaking. The mortgage, the credit cards, Caleb's medical expenses. We're drowning, Franklin. We needed help, and you have all this money just sitting here while we're struggling. So you decided to steal it. It's not stealing, it's family money. Money that should be helping the family instead of just sitting in accounts while you live alone in this big house. The mask had finally come off completely. This wasn't about my welfare or Caleb's needs. It was about money, pure and simple. Well, I said, standing slowly and walking to my desk, since we're being honest about family money, there's something else you should know. I pulled out the papers Vivian had prepared, the new trust documents that would change everything. As of yesterday, all of my assets, the house, the investments, Margaret's life insurance, have been placed in an irrevocable trust for Caleb's benefit. I'm no longer the owner of this property or those accounts. Monica snatched the papers from my hands, her eyes scanning the legal language with growing panic. You can't do this, she whispered. I already have. And since the trust specifies that Caleb's guardians must act in his best interests, and since we now have documentation that you've been hindering his development and neglecting his needs, there may be grounds to modify the guardianship arrangements. Ethan finally found his voice. Dad, you can't be serious. We made mistakes, but we're still his parents. Yes, you are, and I hope you'll learn to be better ones. But in the meantime, Caleb's inheritance is protected from anyone who might see him as a source of income rather than a child to be nurtured. Monica was crying now, ugly sobs that shook her entire body. You've ruined us. Do you understand that? You've destroyed our family. I've protected my grandson, I replied simply. If that ruins your plans, then your plans were wrong to begin with. Caleb had been watching this entire exchange with the wide-eyed attention of a child trying to understand adult complexities. Now he stepped forward and took my hand. Grandpa, he said clearly, thank you for listening to me. The simple statement of gratitude from the boy they'd tried to silence was the decisive blow that brought Monica and Ethan's schemes to an end. They had gambled everything on the assumption that I was a helpless old man and Caleb was a manageable burden. Instead, they'd discovered that both of us were far more capable and determined than they'd ever imagined. As they gathered their things to leave, defeated and exposed, I felt Margaret's presence in the room like a warm embrace. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and social workers and difficult conversations about custody and care. But tonight, justice had been served, and the family that truly mattered, Caleb and I, was safe and whole. The war was essentially over, but the final battle would be fought in a courthouse with witnesses and evidence and the full weight of the law behind us. 3 weeks later, I sat in the courthouse conference room, watching as the final pieces of my carefully constructed case fell into place. The mahogany table was covered with documents, reports, and evidence that painted a devastating picture of Monica and Ethan's neglect and manipulation. Across from me, my son and daughter-in-law sat with their attorney, their faces bearing the hollow expressions of people who had finally realized the magnitude of their miscalculations. Judge Patricia Holbrook presided over the custody hearing with the stern competence of someone who had seen every variety of family dysfunction in her 20 years on the bench. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. This hearing, she began, has been called to determine the custody arrangements for Caleb Harlow, age 8, currently residing with his paternal grandfather, Franklin Harlow. The court has received extensive documentation regarding the child's care, development, and best interests. Monica's attorney, a young man who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the morning progressed, stood to present their case first. Your Honor, my clients are Caleb's biological parents and have been his primary caregivers since birth. While there may have been some miscommunications about his developmental progress, there is no evidence of abuse or willful neglect. The current arrangement is temporary and should not be construed as evidence that the child's parents are unfit. Judge Holbrook nodded politely, then turned to Vivian Carter. Ms. Carter, please present your client's position. Vivian stood with the confidence of an attorney who knew she held all the winning cards. Your Honor, we will demonstrate that Mr. and Mrs. Ethan Harlow have systematically neglected their son's developmental needs, ignored his educational progress, and prioritized their own financial interests over his welfare. Furthermore, we will show that they attempted to incapacitate Mr. Franklin Harlow through the use of unauthorized sedatives, with the intent of gaining control of assets held in trust for the child. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. Those are serious allegations, Ms. Carter. Yes, Your Honor, and we have substantial evidence to support them. What followed was a methodical presentation that laid bare every aspect of Monica and Ethan's failures as parents, and their scheme to exploit both Caleb and me. Vivian began with Mrs. Patterson's testimony, delivered via video conference from Caleb's school. I have been trying to contact Mr. and Mrs. Harlow for 4 months regarding Caleb's remarkable progress, the teacher stated clearly. He has been speaking in full sentences since September, reading at a 5th grade level and demonstrating advanced problem-solving skills. My attempts to share this information with his parents have been completely ignored. She presented her documentation, dozens of unreturned phone calls, ignored emails, and missed conference appointments. The pattern of neglect was undeniable. Derek Martin testified next, his professional assessment of Caleb's abilities serving as a stark contrast to his parents' perception of him as a burden to be managed. In my 20 years as a social worker specializing in special needs children, he stated, I have rarely seen such a dramatic disconnect between a child's actual capabilities and his parents' understanding of those capabilities. Caleb is a bright, articulate, emotionally mature child who has been systematically discouraged from demonstrating his abilities. Pauline Turner followed, her testimony as a retired pediatric nurse carrying significant weight with the court. I observed Caleb during several visits to Mr. Franklin Harlow's home, she said. The child was relaxed, communicative, and clearly thriving in his grandfather's care. He spoke freely about his interests, his schoolwork, and his feelings. The contrast with his behavior around his parents was striking. But it was Sandra Miles, the housekeeper, whose testimony delivered the most damaging blow to Monica and Ethan's case. Mrs. Monica Harlow called me while the family was on their cruise, Sandra stated clearly. She asked me to document any signs of confusion or memory problems in Mr. Franklin Harlow. She specifically wanted me to note if he seemed disoriented or if he had any accidents. When I told her that Mr. Harlow seemed perfectly fine, she seemed disappointed. The judge leaned forward. Disappointed? Yes, Your Honor. She said it would be helpful to have documentation of his declining mental state for when the family needed to make decisions about his care. Monica shifted uncomfortably in her chair, whispering urgently to her attorney. The young lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear. Vivian then presented the financial evidence. Bank statements showing Monica and Ethan's mounting debts, credit card bills that revealed their desperate situation, and the mortgage documents that proved they were facing foreclosure within months. Your Honor, Vivian continued, the defendants were facing financial ruin when they conceived their plan to incapacitate Mr. Harlow and gain control of the trust established for Caleb's benefit. The trust, worth nearly $1 million, would have solved their immediate problems while giving them ongoing access to substantial funds. She produced the thermal carafe, now labeled as evidence, along with a laboratory report that had confirmed the presence of powerful sedatives in the tea Monica had prepared. The defendants attempted to secretly administer Mr. Harlow a combination of sedatives and sleep aids that could have caused severe harm to someone his age, particularly if he had lost his balance while affected by them. Monica's attorney objected weakly, but the evidence was overwhelming. The judge silenced him with a look. Furthermore, Vivian continued, we have audio recordings of the defendants discussing their financial desperation and their plans to address it through control of Mr. Harlow's assets. She played a recording that Derek had made during his assessment, capturing Monica's unguarded comments about the burden of caring for both Caleb and me, and her frustration that all that money was tied up in trusts instead of being available to solve their immediate problems. The final piece of evidence was Caleb himself. Judge Holbrook had arranged for a private interview with the boy, conducted in her chambers with only a court-appointed advocate present. The transcript of that conversation was devastating in its simple honesty. I love my mom and dad, Caleb had told the judge, but they don't really see me. They see the boy who can't talk, not the boy who can. Grandpa sees me. He listens when I have something to say, and he helps me when I need help, but he doesn't treat me like I'm broken. When asked about his preferences, Caleb had been clear. I want to live with Grandpa. I feel safe there, and I feel like I matter. Monica's attorney made a last-ditch effort to salvage their case, arguing that the parents had simply been overwhelmed and that they deserved a chance to correct their mistakes. But Judge Holbrook had heard enough. I have reviewed all the evidence presented today, she said, her voice carrying the weight of final judgment. The pattern of neglect demonstrated by Mr. and Mrs. Ethan Harlow is deeply troubling. Their failure to recognize and nurture their son's developing abilities constitutes educational neglect. Their effort to render Mr. Franklin Harlow helpless through unauthorized substances constitutes a serious violation of the law and potentially attempted fraud. She turned to look directly at Monica and Ethan. Your actions suggest that you view both your son and his grandfather as obstacles to your financial goals rather than family members deserving of care and respect. Monica was crying silently, her carefully applied makeup running in dark streaks down her cheeks. Ethan sat stone-faced, staring at the table as his world collapsed around him. Therefore, Judge Holbrook continued, I am awarding primary custody of Caleb Harlow to his grandfather, Franklin Harlow, with supervised visitation rights for the biological parents. Mr. Franklin Harlow is also granted full authority over the trust established for the child's benefit. She banged her gavel once, the sound echoing through the conference room like a gunshot. Furthermore, I am referring this case to the district attorney's office for potential charges related to the attempt to tamper with Mr. Franklin Harlow's health. This hearing is adjourned. As the judge gathered her papers and left the room, I felt a hand slip into mine. Caleb had been waiting in the hallway with Pauline, and now he stood beside me, his young face serious but unafraid. "Is it over, Grandpa?" he asked quietly. "Yes, buddy," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "It's over." Across the room, Monica had collapsed into her chair, sobbing openly as the full weight of her losses hit her. They had lost their son, their financial security, and their freedom. Criminal charges were almost certain to follow. Ethan sat frozen, staring at nothing as their attorney quietly packed his briefcase. As we walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunlight, Caleb looked up at me with those intelligent dark eyes that had seen too much but had never lost their hope.